My apple crisp with frozen apples recipe is easy and delicious. If you want to make this old-fashioned dessert at any time of the year, this version is one you need to try. Let's go over the ingredients. I'm using an 8x8 casserole dish, so for the bottom apple layer, you will need 16 ounces of frozen apple slices, which is 1 pound or 454 grams. I'm using Golden Delicious apples. My recommendation would be yellow or Granny Smith apples, but you can use whatever type you want. To which I'm going to add 1/3 cup of white sugar as I measure 70 grams, 1/3 cup of light brown sugar as I measure 80 grams, 1 tablespoon of lemon juice, 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of ginger, and 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg, 1/8 teaspoon of salt, and then 2 tablespoons of cornstarch to thicken it. For the crumble topping, I'm going to use 1/2 cup of all these ingredients. So 1/2 cup of flour, all-purpose flour, as I measure 75 grams. 1/2 cup of oats. I'm using quick cooking, but you can use old-fashioned rolled oats, 40 grams. 1/2 cup of light brown sugar as I measure 120 grams. And for texture, 1/2 cup of chopped pecans, 60 grams. And also 1 stick of butter. I am using unsalted, 113 grams. The pecans, you can use them straight out of the bag, but I actually toasted mine. I put them on an ungreased baking sheet at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 minutes. Then I took them out, I stirred them, put them back in for 2 minutes, so a total of 5. They're going to keep toasting in the oven, so I didn't want to over toast them. But my oven is preheated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. My casserole dish is buttered, so I am ready to go. The apple filling is really simple. My frozen apple slices are thawed. You want to make sure that they're thawed. And now we're just going to mix everything that I have here together. So I'm going to add in the sugar. Like I said, 1/3 cup of white and 1/3 cup of light brown sugar. Tablespoon of lemon juice to help balance out the flavors. 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of ginger, and 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg. If you want to add 1/8 teaspoon of cloves, you can. A little bit of salt just to balance out all the flavors. And then, like I said, 2 tablespoons of cornstarch. And once everything is mixed together, I'm just gonna pour the apples into my greased 8x8 baking dish. And then I'm just going to spread them out evenly. One thing I forgot to mention is that you do want your butter to stay cold. So if you're like me and you have all of your ingredients, it's not a big deal. But if you're gonna be working on this first, make sure your butter stays in the refrigerator so that it is nice and cold. As you can see, the apple layer is done. So now it's time to work on the crumble topping. And the first step is getting the butter ready. So here I have my stick of butter, and my goal is to cut it into pea-sized bits. So I'm just gonna cut it into very thin slices, maybe not quite as thin as a dumb cake if you've seen me make my dumb cakes. Almost, but not quite. It's like that, maybe 4 slices per tablespoon. And then I'm going to cut the butter this way into strips. And then once it's cut into strips, I'm going to cut it the other way. So that is a nice, simple way to make the pea-sized bits of butter that you need. If your butter is really cold, you might be able to grate it on a cheese grater or something like that, but if you don't have any special equipment, just a plate and a sharp knife, and this is probably the best way to go about doing it. This is extremely difficult if your butter is not cold, so that's why I said make sure your butter is cold. It's going to be a lot easier to cut, and make sure your knife is very sharp as well. So cold butter and a sharp knife are needed for this to be successful. I'm done chopping my butter into small pea-sized pieces. Now I'm going to do the second step of making the crumble, which is adding together the dry ingredients. So I'm going to take my half a cup of flour, half a cup of oats, and half a cup of brown sugar. And I think earlier in the video I forgot to mention I'm also going to add 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt to this crumble topping. Now I'm just going to mix. You could mix them directly into the butter, but I think this might work out a little bit easier if you combine the dry ingredients first. Notice the pecans are still off to the side. That's because I think they're easier to add at the end. So they're just gonna stay there for now, and then once this is mixing with the butter, then I'll add the pecans. I think they're best in the final step. And notice I'm not adding any spices directly to the crumble topping. I personally am kind of afraid that they'll burn. Maybe they won't, but if you want to add an equal amount of spices to the crumble topping, you can. You can let me know how it turns out. Now for the most time-consuming part of this recipe. You could use some specialized equipment, but honestly, I think your hands might be your best tools. Take a little bit of butter on a larger plate or other work surface. Take some of that dry mixture and then just work it together with your hands like this. I need more. And you want to make little crumbles. What you want is you want little pieces of butter that are completely coated by the dry mixture. So that's why we first cut the butter into little pieces. You could probably melt the butter and then mix it in with the dry ingredients and then put it on top of your apple layer, but I think the texture might be a little bit different. It might not be quite as crispy. So if anyone does this a different way and it works out, please let me know what you think, how it went in comparison to this, if it was faster, easier, slower. It's always good to have feedback. That's good. So you want something like wet sand. Something like this is the texture that you want. You want these little pieces of wet sand, the butter that are just completely coated in that dry mixture. So once I have a batch done, I'll just push it off to the side. Then I'll bring over some more butter, some more my dry topping, and like I said, just work it in like this. This is time consuming, but if you want a really good apple crisp, taking a little bit of time to do this step right is important, I think. My crumble topping is now finished. As you can see, it has the texture of like bits of wet sand. Now it's time to add the pecans, chopped pecans. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to work them in to the crumbles. Now it's time to put the crumble topping on the apples. So I'm just gonna take my crumble mixture here, and I'm just gonna pull it apart as needed and crumble it even more on top of the apples. And actually, this is probably the point where you want to kind of get these crumbles on the smaller side. It's going to help you have more even coverage. I'd say maybe slightly bigger than pea size. But just rub your fingers together, and you will just naturally make these kind of crumbles. Just put those on top of the apples. Try to get this as evenly spread out as possible. You get good coverage, because this doesn't have a crust, so this is going to be the crispy topping. Notice how I am very lightly sprinkling the crumbles on top. I'm not packing them down. I'm definitely not mixing. I'm literally just crumbling this topping on top. You definitely do not want to pat it down or mix, because that is going to ruin the crispy texture. My apple crisp with frozen apples is now assembled. Now it's time to put it into the oven. As you can see, I have a pizza pan here. This is not required, but I almost always bake cobblers and pies and things like that on a pizza pan or a cookie sheet, just to make it easier to put into the oven and take out. I'm going to bake this at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, uncovered. I'll let you know for how long. My apple crisp with frozen apples just came out of the oven. It was in at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, uncovered, for 60 minutes, 1 hour. You can see it bubbling. It smells absolutely fantastic. As you can see, the crisp looked absolutely fantastic. The crumble topping was perfectly golden brown with a bit of the sweet syrup bubbling up from underneath. I actually didn't get a chance to try this right after making it because it got too late, so I put it into the refrigerator and I tried it the next day. And when I finally cut the first slice and took the first bite, I knew that my apple crisp with frozen apples recipe was a big success, because it was absolutely delicious. First, let's talk about the flavor. This dessert definitely had an apple flavor, but not as strong as apple pie or cobbler because of the amount of spices in the fruit layer and the amount of butter in the crumble. Even though the apple flavor wasn't as prominent in this dessert as it is in others, this still tasted great because the spices like the cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg were in perfect amounts, the brown sugar as well, everything coming together to give the fruit layer a fantastic depth of flavor. The lemon juice was present as well, and it played a key role in bringing out the flavors and intensifying them. The crumble layer was, as you would expect, buttery, but it also had a good amount of flavor because of the brown sugar. The oatmeal and pecans were noticeable as well, but more in the background, their main contribution being the texture. So, in short, every bite of this apple crisp was an explosion of flavor in my mouth, much deeper and more complex than a normal apple pie, cobbler, or dump cake. Now let's talk about the texture. As I'm holding the first slice up to the camera, you can see that the crumble topping was very crispy and crunchy. The oatmeal and pecans really were important in making this extra crispy and crunchy, so I think that they are critical ingredients in this. The softened apples and juicy syrup were present in every bite as well, but in the background, allowing the crispiness and crunchiness of the crumble topping to take center stage. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that it's been a long time, multiple years actually, since I last made a fruit crisp, and I'm glad that I made this one because this apple crisp with frozen apples was absolutely fantastic. It surpassed all of my expectations. Even though I would give this recipe a 15 out of 10, there are still a few things that I think you should know. First, the type of apple. Although you could theoretically use any type, I use Golden Delicious because that's what I normally use when I bake, because I think they have the perfect combination of sweetness, flavor, and also resilience to being baked or cooked. Granny Smith would work as well, but I personally would not use a sweet apple like Fuji or Honeycrisp because I think they might make the dessert too sweet. Also, sweet apples tend to have less pectin, so they don't hold up as well to being baked, so you might end up with an overly sweet and very mushy fruit layer. Second, I know it might seem weird adding oatmeal and pecans to a fruit dessert, but trust me on this, they add so much texture, you do not want to leave them out. And although it's optional, I highly recommend toasting the pecans first because that really brings out the flavor. Also, I'm not sure if I explained myself very well when I was explaining how to make the crumble topping. Honestly, I think it's something that's best showed with a video and demonstrated than explained in words. But in short, you want to massage the dry ingredients into the small bits of flour and make crumbles that have the texture of wet sand. But like I said, I think referring to the video, seeing how I make the crumble topping, seeing how I move my fingers, and then paying attention to how it looks when it's done, that's really going to teach you how to make it. The only other thing I wanted to point out is the use of lemon juice. I think the lemon juice really brings out the flavors, but if you add too much, especially if you freeze your own apple slices and you add lemon juice to them, you might make it too tart. In total, I probably use maybe 3 tablespoons because I put some on the apple slices when I froze them. It was kind of tart in the fruit layer. I liked it because it helped to balance out the sweetness in the crumble topping, but that's just something to keep in mind, not to overuse lemon juice. But like I already said, this apple crisp using frozen apples was absolutely unforgettable. It would be perfect for a fall holiday like Thanksgiving or Christmas, or any time of the year, Easter, Mother's Day, St. Patrick's Day, anytime. If you make this, I know you'll like it. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time.